Good morning. I'm Herb Heathcote, member of the Board of Trustees. I'm replacing Jeff. We had actually traded while I was on vacation, so I'm doing the announcements this morning. Welcome, everyone. One announcement is that we have a bonus hymn today. It appears just after the announcements, and so we'll be getting more singing than usual. This is great. Remember to wear your mask while you're singing. Because those who are wearing the headphone mics don't wear masks because it interferes with their headphone and it gets all fouled up. So our minister doesn't wear a mask, but he's protecting us by social distancing. Cedars, in partnership with Kol Shalom, offers Super Supper dinners on the last Tuesday of each month at Eagle Harbor Congregational Church. And I'm happy to report that about 30 people were served at the Super Supper last Tuesday. So that's the end of the announcements. Thank you.
Hymn of the month, and I'm going to ask each one of you to exceed your normal volume of your marks today.
guess it helps if I remember my words. The readings for today's service are not included with the title in our order of service, and that was partly because I was not in town most of the week, and by the time I selected them, the order of service had already gone to print. So I'll introduce our readings as I go through them today, and if you would like more information after the service, please see me. I'm happy to share any of the names, the titles with all of you. These opening words come from Gordon McKeanman, and this reading is titled, "We Summon Ourselves." We summon ourselves from the demands and delights of the daily round, from the dirty dishes and unwaxed floors, from unmowed grass and untrimmed bushes, from all the incompleteness and not yet startedness, from the unholy, from the unresolved. We summon ourselves to attend to our vision of peace and justice, our vision of wholeness and health, our vision of delight and devotion, our vision of the lovely and the holy, of who we are and what we can do. We summon the power of tradition and the exhilaration of newness, the wisdom of the ages and the knowing of the very young. We summon beauty, eloquence, poetry, and music to be the bearers of our dreams. We would open our eyes, our ears, our minds, our hearts to the amplest dimensions of life. We summon ourselves. We rejoice in the manifold promises and possibilities unfolding. We summon ourselves into this moment together in the fullness of who and how we are as we come together to worship. Come, let us worship together.
In 1878, the composer Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky completed perhaps his most ambitious work, the Violin Concerto in D. Since Tchaikovsky was a pianist and not a violinist, he had the violinist Iosif Kotyek help him clean up some of the more technical and difficult parts of the score for the solo violin. Of course, the solo violin piece is still just crazy difficult. The first violinist who said he would perform the piece, I think it was 1881, backed out saying that he was unsure of the intrinsic worth of the piece, and then later admitted that when he did finally play it, he had changed the music. You might be familiar with the 1985 movie Back to the Future. In the movie, the main character, Marty McFly, played by Michael J. Fox, finds himself in 1955 playing on the guitar a Little Richard song, Johnny Be Good, at a high school dance. And he is so into playing the guitar up on the stage that he loses control and becomes an archetypal rock star. He's kicking over the amplifiers. He's playing the guitar behind his head. He's laying on his back, still playing furiously, pushing himself across the stage. It is this movie the scene that my mind returns to every time I hear the third movement of the Tchaikovsky violin concerto. The notes are released in flurries, delirious with newfound freedom. I imagine a violinist, say Joshua Bell, playing with the Seattle Symphony in Benaroya Hall. He loses control. He's playing the violin behind his head. He's laying on his back, still playing frenetically, as he pushes himself across the stage in front of the conductor's platform. When Tchaikovsky wrote this piece, he had a lot going on in his life. The previous year, he had been married in Russia, but his marriage had only lasted a few months, probably because he had stated that the only woman he had ever loved was some other woman he had known 10 years earlier. That and the likelihood that the violinist I mentioned earlier, Josef Kotek, had probably been his lover at the time of his marriage. Add to that a history of depression. It makes me wonder what Tchaikovsky was thinking about when writing his concerto. He had taken a break and was in Switzerland. Sadly, he doesn't document his thoughts, and so we are left forever to wonder. I dedicate the lighting of our flaming chalice to the artists who give us such beautiful things. Please join with me and repeat our affirmation as printed in the order of service. As we come together to worship, we remind ourselves to treat all people kindly because we are one family, to take good care of the earth because it's our home, and to live lives full of love and goodness because that is how we will all become the best that we can be.
Now if you would mask up, stand up, as you are willing and able. It's hymn number 128, 128.
So, a long time ago, in an undescript place, near a border though, there was a border guard. His job was to wait at the border and make sure that anyone who was coming and going paid the tax on the valuable things crossing the border. He took his job very seriously. You see, he got a little bit of a cut for everything that he caught going through. So it was in his interest to make sure no contraband, nothing left untaxed made it across the border in either direction. One day, as the border guard was doing his job, waiting there at the border, he noticed in the distance a rather strange-looking traveler. As they got closer, he realized that it was a woman, and she was leading behind her a donkey on a rope, and the donkey was piled with bales of straw. This looks suspicious, thought the guard. As the woman got up to where he was, he said, "Stop, stop, stop, right there. Let me see what you're hiding in there." He dug through the straw, through all of it, just piece by piece, looking for something and found nothing. Finally, he told the woman, "Fine, you can go." He still felt there was something suspicious. He just knew it deep down. A week later, as he was standing there, guarding the border, doing his job, he noticed again that same woman with a donkey on a rope, leading it with bales of straw stacked on its back. Again, thought the guard, I'm going to find something this time. I know it. So he stops the woman, searches through all of the bales of straw, and again, finds nothing. Another week goes by, and the same thing happens. Week after week, this woman, as if clockwork, presents herself at the border with a donkey and the bales of straw. The border guard knew something was happening, something was up. He just couldn't prove it. Finally, he just had to push his suspicion out of his mind. And each week when the woman came, he just waved her through. Go on, I know you're not carrying anything. Well, the years went by, and the woman continued to do this week after week. But eventually, the guard, who had been doing this job for many years now, reached retirement. It was time for him to retire. I'm no longer going to guard the border. I'm no longer in charge of finding the contraband, collecting taxes on all of the products. I'm going to just live my life. And he did. He settled down in a small village and lived a quiet life. He enjoyed gardening and did a little bit of fishing too. He found the simple things brought him a lot of joy. But one day, when he was in the village, he saw that same woman, the woman who had come week after week to the border with the donkey and the bales of straw. He couldn't resist. He said, I've got to know. I have got to know. What was she up to all these years? He went up to the woman as she was sitting there and said, "Hello." She looked at him and said, "Hello back. You might not remember me, but I was the guard at the border who always stopped you and searched your donkey in the straw looking for contraband." "Yes, I remember. I wouldn't forget your face." "Well, I'm retired now, and you've got to do me a favor. There's something I'm just really, really curious about. I know you were smuggling something all those years. You won't get in trouble. I won't turn you in, but just for my own purposes, would you tell me what it is?" "I don't know what you mean," the woman replied. "Surely you were smuggling something. Every week like clockwork you presented yourself and I could find nothing." "I'm not sure what you're talking about. Please, just tell me." Finally, the woman smiled and relented. And she says, "Do you know what I was smuggling all those times?" "What?" said the guard. "Donkeys." And that is our story. Earlier this week, people around our country paused to mark Trans Day of Remembrance, or Trans Day of Visibility, a day meant to celebrate the lives of trans people living among us. People have been living among us, trans people have been living among us forever. The same week, just across the border in Idaho, the Idaho legislator passed a law limiting access to trans-affirming health care, also limiting access to abortions and criminalizing people leaving the state to seek reproductive care. I want to invite us to pause for a moment, to think of the trans folks, all of us who are impacted by such laws, to hold them in our minds and hearts. And I'd like to do this by sharing these words of prayer by M. Jade Kaiser. But first, let's take a breath. In a world that is so boringly, so violently, so stubbornly insisting on its stale and narrow gender rules and regulations, God themselves is in a state of constant transition. Though many try to tame their wild, make them into an image of power, to fix them permanently to one static being, they are change in a world that loves control. They are our attempts at definition and confusion. They trouble our most basic assumptions about ourselves, about the earth, about each other. God, unwilling to stick to a single form for our comfortable comprehension, incapable of making themselves so flat, their names are always changing. They are a multitude of incarnations, our deliverer from the status quo, our liberator from the ordinary logics of power, our invitation into the abundance of possibilities within and around us. What a blessing every child, trans or not, birthed unto us is. What a precious glimpse of life, holy encounters, gracious invitations to recognize the image of the sacred in all. The gift of being and becoming so much more than what's placed upon us. The possibilities for living without losing part of ourselves. The desire to know and be known. Vulnerability, vulnerably, truthfully, entirely alive in all of us. I missed my page. In all of us. May we hold the possibilities of change, of transformation, of healing in us, that others might experience these things through us. May we bless those in need of blessings, and in turn be blessed ourselves. May it be so. Amen.
On many Sundays, we set aside some time for the sharing of joys and sorrows. If you have a joy or a sorrow that you would like to share, please come forward and state your name, and in a few brief sentences, tell us your joy or sorrow. For a sorrow, place a stone in the bowl so that we may all share your burden. For a joy, pour a little water in the bowl so we may all be buoyed up. As a reminder, this part of the service is neither live streamed nor recorded.
Since you know it's a hymn of the month, you have to really pay attention to the words. And I have a confession to make. This is one of my favorite hymns. I've sung it for years. It was actually sung at my college graduation.
Oh.
And I still can't remember the words. So please help me out.
1, 2, 3, right?
One, two, three.
Spirit
You ever wonder why we are even here? We have a chance to talk to friends. We have a chance to think about something in a new way. Perhaps it's just a moment of respite from all of the activities that we have to do but can't do here. But going back to a line from a hymn that we sang earlier, all life is a gift which we are called to use to build the common good. Are we not also building the common good here? One way to do that is to contribute financially. If today is your first time visiting, please feel free to let the baskets pass you by. You are our guest, and we are happy simply that you are with us. Would the ushers come forward to collect the offering? Thank you for your gifts.
Location, location, location. Perhaps you've heard this real estate mantra before. It's the stereotypical line used in media to capture the energy of a real estate transaction. When I reflect on this mantra, what I take it to mean is context, context, context. The location of a given property is its context. Is it near the water or within walking distance to restaurants and shops? Is it the ideal property for a commuter or perhaps an up-and-coming neighborhood with the right price point for a first-time home buyer? When I hear the line location, 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 what I hear is context, context, context. So what is context beyond just this locationality aspect? The Oxford English Dictionary defines context as the circumstances that form the setting of an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. In terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. Context is everything. When we take the particular, a specific situation, a specific person, and situate that particular in a larger framework, we begin to understand a little better. What does this word mean? How can I apply what I've learned? And why does this house cost so much? Are all questions that can be answered by situating the particular within a larger context. Psychologists like to talk about this sort of context in terms of individuals using the word gestalt. Gestalt theory emphasizes that the whole of anything is greater than its parts. That is, the attributes of the whole are not deducible from analysis of the parts in isolation. That we need to understand the whole of something, look at the whole circumstances. Essentially, this means that in order to understand the psychology of any given individual, the particular must be located in the context. Location, location, location. We find ourselves in a particular location this month. April is one of my favorite months. It's National Poetry Month. I'm not someone who usually observes months like National Poetry Month or things. Oftentimes, I don't know they've even happened until we've already moved past them and I see all of the Facebook and social media posts about them. But for whatever reason, I love stopping in the month of April and using it as a time to explore poetry. If you don't know, I love poetry. I love reading it. I love listening to poets give readings, whether live or a recording. I love talking about poetry. I get excited when I discover a poem that, for whatever reason, it finally clicks and I understand what it's about. I just love to talk about it. Elliot has to put up with a lot of that at home, late nights in the kitchen while he's trying to do dishes when he's home, and I'm going on and on about something I just read. And sometimes I even love trying to write my own poetry. I shared a little for those of you who have joined the poetry writing workshop this month. Yesterday was our first session at the Cedar Center, and I shared a few little poems that I had written as a way of encouraging folks to jump into writing their own. Just a side note, if that sounds interesting, there's still time to join. We have 2 more sessions this month, and we'd love to have you. It's okay if you missed the first one. We'll get you in there. In my experience, poetry is not always the most accessible form of art. It's not for everyone. It makes use of words that require a lot of context clues to figure out. I have learned more words, expanded my vocabulary more from reading poetry than probably any other genre, besides maybe just flipping through the dictionary. Reading poetry, I learned from Robert Frost what a guy line is. The line that connects a tent down to the stake in the ground, a guy line. I never would have known what that was. Or John Ashbery in his poem, Illustration, who talks about a peplum when he's describing a woman's dress, a long, flowing, pleated material. I never would have known what a peplum was if it weren't for John Ashbery. Or sometimes it's not just a word, but a larger concept. Samuel Taylor Coleridge in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner taught me not only what an albatross is, but all of the lore and maritime superstition that surround these birds, and why it's not a good idea to kill an albatross while you're at sea. We can talk more about that later if you'd like to know. Each of these was something specific in a given poem that upon encountering the word or the creature caused questions within me to rise. It caused me to do a little bit of research, break out the dictionary, go on Google, research into history, language, ecology, and culture. Poetry has caused me to grow and learn a lot, and I sometimes think it's the enigmatic quality of it that has done this. The way I look at a good poem is sort of like a puzzle. Not like the puzzles we talked about a few weeks ago, but a sort of a logic game. Something for your mind and heart to struggle with. It requires you to think and feel and quest to understand. Sometimes the littlest line can contain such meaning. Have you ever felt yourself so curious about something that you couldn't let it go? Ever once in your life felt just so curious about something you couldn't let it go? Maybe your curiosity at times has gotten you in trouble. You were just so persistent to get to the bottom of something that you overlooked everything else. I think back to the story that I shared earlier about the border guard who was so sure that the woman was smuggling something that even years later, once he had retired, he still just had to know. He went out of his way to get to the bottom of it. I felt this way about poems myself. Felt as if there was something concealed on the page beneath my very nose. For instance, the Cuban poet and author Reinaldo Arenas has a whole series of poems, some quite long, like book-length poems, all about sugarcane plantations. Sugarcane plantations, long books, like we're talking like 100-page poem all about harvesting sugarcane, smashing it into pulp, gathering the juices from it. And as I read these poems, they're not like any of Reinaldo Arenas' other poems. Most of his poetry explores themes of sexuality and sensuality and Cuban life. So why all of this writing about sugarcane? In 1969, Fidel Castro's state-enforced voluntary work program was put in full effect. People who were not seen as working essential jobs, whatever those were, whether within the bureaucracy of the party or in other places in society, all those who were working non-essential jobs were sent to farms and to plantations to participate in a massive agricultural scheme. The U.S. embargo on Cuba had been in place for several years at this point, and the Cuban economy had taken quite a hit. In response, Castro concocted a plan to plant and produce millions of tons of high-value crops to sell to other communist countries to boost the economy. Chief and most prized among these crops was sugarcane. By 1969, a policy was sugarcane. In 1970, the poet Reinaldo Arenas was sent along with many other writers to work in these plantations. This was an effort put forth by the National Union of Cuban Writers and Artists. I would say it was an effort forced on them by the Castro regime. And the idea was to send these artists, these writers, out into these agricultural work environments and have them to romanticize the setting, to romanticize the work, to paint pictures that showed solidarity and write poems that made it seem like this was the bright future they had fought for. Reinaldo Arenas wrote so much about sugarcane because that was the context in which he found himself. Location, location, location. Each of us exists in a context that is uniquely specific to us. Our location in the world, the things that we experience, the relationships we have, all of these come together to shape us. If you want to know why someone does something the way that they do, get to know them. When we can situate the individual in their larger context, noticing the complex web of circumstances that makes each of us, that makes each of these people who they are, we can arrive at a deeper understanding. It's that gestalt that psychologists talk about. Eventually, after a few years of writing and working in the sugarcane plantations, Reinaldo Arenas was let go released, you might say. And over the next few decades, though, he found himself facing increasing persecution. When he wasn't being forced to write for the Communist Party, oftentimes wrote things that were subversive. He was known for criticizing the Castro regime and found himself in prison a number of times because of this. He was also imprisoned at one point due to his identity as a gay man. Both offenses, the publishing subversive material and homosexuality, were illegal and punishable in Cuba at the time. And despite this, even while in prison, Arenas continued to write. At one point, and I won't say how, he quite graphically convinces another inmate who is getting out to smuggle a novel that he has been working out of prison. Now, I'll let your imagination fill in the blank, but they weren't letting you take many things out of prison, so there's only so many places you can really hide things. Despite persecution, forced labor, and imprisonment, Arenas continued to write. In 1979, Castro granted exit permits to political prisoners who were deemed unimportant. Somehow, Arenas got grouped in with this group unintentionally. And because it was the age before digital records, he was able to actually forge his own exit visa, change the name slightly, so that way he could get out of the country. Dozens of people crowded onto a small boat and made their way to Florida. Arenas was among these who arrived on May 4th with all of these people, and he soon found a home in the United States. His poetry quickly became popular among Cubans living in exile. And not just that, literary circles and universities started asking him to come and speak and give readings. His poetry, however, in the late 1980s eventually took a stark new direction. He no longer talked about the sensualities of life or life under the communist regime. Soon, the theme of death began to permeate his writing. It's no coincidence that this change came at a point in Ronaldo's life when he was diagnosed with HIV. At that time, the survival rate was quite low, and as his own health began to wane, his writing provided him a place to reflect on the condition he was in. His memoir, this book, Before Night Falls, in his memoir, Arenas reflects on his life from beginning to end. I would argue, too, the book in itself is a work of poetry on its own. It's quite beautiful and striking and at times even a little disturbing, but deeply meaningful. He tells his life story in all its visceral and gritty details. The good and the bad are all here. It was his final work. By this point, when he was writing, his HIV diagnosis had advanced to AIDS, but he was determined still to tell his story. He continued to write until his final days, which actually is where the title of the memoir comes from. Before Night Falls is an extended metaphor about his desire to finish this book before his life drew to an end. Upon finishing it, he scrawled a letter to his friends and left it that read, "Dear friends, due to my delicate state of health and the terrible emotional depression it causes me not to be able to continue writing and struggling for the freedom of Cuba, I'm ending my life. During the past few years, even though I felt very ill, I have been able to finish my literary work to which I have been devoted almost 30 years. You are the heirs of all my terrors, but also of my hope that Cuba will soon be free. I am satisfied to have contributed, though in very small way, to the triumph of this freedom. I end my life voluntarily because I cannot continue working. Persons near me are in no way responsible for my decision. There's only one person I hold accountable: Fidel Castro. The suffering of exile, the pain of being banished from my country, the loneliness and the disease contracted in exile would probably never have happened if I had been able to enjoy freedom in my country. I want to encourage the Cuban people out of the country as well as those on the island to continue fighting for freedom. I do not want to convey to you a message of defeat, but of continued struggle and hope. Cuba will be free. I already am. To those who knew Arenas, his death was no surprise. He had been reflecting on his death for some time. Just the year before, in 1989, he wrote a short but fitting poem titled Self-Epitaph. It reads, "A bad poet in love with the moon, he counted terror as his only fortune, and it was enough, because being no saint, he knew that life is risk or abstinence, that every great ambition is great insanity, and the most sordid horror has its charm. He lived for life's sake, which means seeing death as a daily occurrence on which we wager a splendid body or our entire lot. He knew the best things are those we abandon, precisely because we are leaving. The everyday becomes hateful. There's just one place to live, the impossible. He knew imprisonment offenses typical of human baseness, but was always escorted by a certain stoicism that helped him to walk the tightrope or enjoy the morning's glory. And when he trotted, a window would appear for him to jump towards infinity. He wanted no ceremony, speech, mourning, or cry, no sandy mound where his skeleton be laid to rest. Not even after death did he wish to live in peace. He ordered that his ashes be scattered at sea, where they would be in constant flow. He hasn't lost the habit of dreaming. He hopes some adolescent will plunge into his waters." Context is everything. I don't know that I would know as much about the poetry of Reinaldo Arenas and how to decode it, how to unpack the themes and metaphors that he provides, if I hadn't engaged with his story, if I hadn't learned about his life. In some ways, I'd like to think that I, in my college years, was the adolescent that Arenas hoped would plunge into these waters, to breathe life into words left on a page and situate them in a greater context of meaning, and in some way make them my own. A poem can often be understood as a standalone work of art. Some of my favorite poems are poems in which I know little about the poet's life. However, in the cases where I have gone deeper, I have found a greater appreciation and understanding. And while I recognize that not everyone sees themselves as a writer or a poet, I think that the same principle that I apply to Arenas' poetry applies to each of us as individuals. I think that when we take the time to go deep, to learn the stories of those people in our lives, to understand the context from which they're operating, we come to deeper understanding which allows us to forge closer connections. To understand someone's context Suddenly, a bigger picture begins to emerge, allowing us to see and be seen, to be known and to know. Context is everything. Context is what gives the particular their meaning and helps to give definition to ourselves, to our community, and to the world around us, to the glory of life. For our closing hymn of the day, I'd like to invite you to rise in body or spirit as you're willing and able, to don your masks as we prepare to sing hymn number 134 in our hymnals, Our World is One World.
Please repeat after me as we extinguish our flaming chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth. The warmth of community or the fire of commitment. The warmth of community or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Our service this day has ended, but our service to the world and one another begins anew. May we go forth from this time together with a deepened sense of curiosity, genuine curiosity, calling us to explore the context and complex situations of the people around us. May it be so.